So first, let's start off with some introductions. And joining me tonight is Dr. Kendrick Davis. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Good evening. Thank you guys for coming out. Stop. You guys are too kind. We have to earn the applause. However, I've been with UCR since 2012. I'm associate professor in health sciences, clinical family medicine, and I'm also associate dean of assessment and evaluation.
And I'm Rosemary Tyrrell, the Director of Faculty Development for the School of Medicine, and also an Associate Professor of Family Medicine. I realize I never say that, but it actually is part of my title now. And because this workshop tonight is CME eligible, I have to do the usual disclosures that so many of you are familiar with, which means that we will not be, we don't have any financial interests or relationships to report, and we don't intend to reference unlabeled or unapproved uses of drugs or products in the presentation, which I always think is hilarious since I'm not an MD. I'm not going to be recommending drugs of any kind. So the CME link is there on the slide. If you don't have time to get it written down and would like me to email it to you, I'm happy to do that. Just shoot me an email and I'll make sure you get the link. If you haven't applied for CME for our workshops before, well, our CME provider is Annenberg, and you have to go and create a profile there, but it's very, very easy to do, so you have to sign up for that. Then once you do, every time you attend one of our sessions, you will be able to claim CME from that session. So if that's useful to you, please remember to do that. So I want to see if this little clicker thing is working. Yes, it is. So tonight, what are we here to talk about? Well, we want to define, first of all, what is inclusive and culturally responsive teaching? What are we talking about, but what do we mean by that? And we talked a lot about how sometimes around this issue of inclusion and diversity, sometimes there's a lot of fatigue because people feel like they've heard it all a million times before. But what we're really doing is we're looking at actual teaching strategies and some things that may impact some learners more than others. We're going to recognize the needs of, I hope that you'll be able to recognize the needs of underserved learners. You'll have an opportunity to utilize inclusive instructional strategies and have an opportunity to develop strategies for addressing learning climate concerns. All right, so I have a little activity. These are numbered, and I'm going to ask you to read them in numerical order. So pick one. Anyone will do. Faster than that. Pick one, anyone. Oh, there you go. All right. Whoever has the one that's marked number 1, please go ahead and read that. Did I accidentally?
I treat all students the same. Therefore, I have an inclusive classroom.
Okay, what do we think about that? Read it again. I think people are munching and not listening.
Including me. I treat all students the same. Therefore, I have an inclusive classroom.
What do you think? Is that true? I treat everyone the same, therefore my classroom is inclusive. Not true, okay? Somebody read number 2 for me.
My classroom is inclusive because my students are demographically diverse, including race, gender, age, etc.
And what do you think of that?
I don't think it's true at all.
Includes everybody. They're all in there. I've ticked every box. No? Yeah, obviously, these are myths around the issue of inclusion and diversity. Who has number 3? Did you read that one for us?
Sure. By reaching the STEM fields, so discussion of inclusion are not relevant to my course.
I don't teach in the humanities. I don't teach in touchy-feely things. We deal in facts, so this issue is not relevant to what I do. Who has number 4?
If I spend time worrying about inclusive practice, it would jeopardize the education of other learners.
If I waste time on this touchy-feely inclusive stuff, then other learners, and I don't exactly know who you mean by other learners, will suffer for it. Also myths. And who has, where were we? 5.
Inclusion is an educational fad. The pendulum will swing back, so why bother?
Inclusions, if it's a fad, it's just another fad. Why worry about it? Because pretty soon we'll be talking about something else. And number 6, I showed it before she read it, sorry.
I know I have an inclusive learning environment because everyone seems happy.
Everyone seems happy, so it must be okay. And would it surprise you, maybe not, to hear that I've actually heard these comments over my many, many years of doing this kind of training, people saying, well, really, what difference does it make? I'm going to go back to my first slide because inclusive teaching, as we know, doesn't occur automatically. It requires planning. It requires promoting across the spectrum of teaching practices from course design to assessment with the aim of creating a learning environment that allows all students to engage regardless of discipline, regardless of course content, regardless of the area of study. And then in these ones, when it's done correctly, supportive, inclusive education enriches the quality of the education overall, and research has consistently documented the benefits for all students. So denying diversity diminishes the lives of students with or without issues related to diversity. So this idea that it's going to jeopardize the others, it's nonsense. And this educational fad has been around for about 4 decades. So I think it's really not the fad that some people seem to think it is. And just because everybody seems happy doesn't necessarily mean they are happy. So how would you define inclusive teaching? Yeah, you. How would you define it? There's no wrong answer.
Well, I think you have to take into account various backgrounds somebody give me a hand.
You can toss the ball.
Well, I think that you just have to be aware that there are going to be people with different things. Be prepared for that, as you said, and not just walk in with a canned lecture.
Excellent. Toss that ball to somebody else. How would you define inclusive teaching? Nice catch, by the way. I noticed that
I see you work. You represent.
you don't play tennis together, I hope, because that's a no-no in tennis, what you just did.
Inclusive training, or teaching, excuse me, something, it should encompass all students because just because I'm good with hands-on learning doesn't mean that Dr. Davis is good as I may. He gets his knowledge from books or anything like that.
And inclusive teaching incorporates a wide spectrum of practices. One of the areas that we're not going to delve too deeply into tonight, but is something I talk about in a different course, which is Universal Design for Learning. How many people have ever heard of UDL? Have heard of that at all? Okay. So what Universal Design for Learning teaches us is that when we strive to make accommodations for people with special needs, we discover that those accommodations don't just help those people, but help everyone. So the perfect example that I like to use is curb cuts, right? Curb cuts. They made curb cuts so that people in wheelchairs would have an easier time crossing the street. That was the whole purpose of them. But we found out pretty soon that it's also really nice if you have a stroller, or if you're riding a bicycle, or you're pulling a luggage behind you, that it is really beneficial to everyone. When there's an ADA requirement that if you use videos in an online course, they have to be captioned, just like you don't have to have somebody in a wheelchair, but you still have to have a ramp on your building, you still have to have them captioned. And I found that even though I didn't have any visually impaired students in my online classes, I was hearing from students how useful they found it was to have those captions. So even if the English language learners found it helpful to see the written word. Sometimes people said, well, I'm studying in Starbucks and it's noisy and I can just turn the volume off and put the captions on and still understand what you're saying. So that's what we mean by universal design. It's creating learning strategies in a learning environment that basically encompasses the needs of all students, because that way it benefits more than just the group that we may have been aiming for originally. And culturally responsive teaching, sometimes these two things are used interchangeably, and they are very similar, but there's a slight difference. Do you want to talk about culturally responsive teaching?
actually love this. So you can read the definitions yourself, but I think it's a good thing to delve into it. So while often used interchangeably, like she's saying, they're slightly different. Inclusion and culturally responsive teaching. Using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and frame of reference, and performance style of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. And I'm going to use an example in a moment. It teaches to and through the strengths of these students. So we have all adults in here. There's a test. My mother's an educator who ironically has a school named in her honor. She was a teacher for a lot of years and ended up being a principal. But initially she started in Watts in Los Angeles. Is anyone familiar with that area? Nobody? Yeah, come on now, I see a few head nods. So just to be very clear, Watts is an extremely underserved environment. When my mother taught kindergarten there, you literally had a scenario where she'd have 8-year-olds in the kindergarten class, kids she was having to teach to tie their shoes, to do basic things like hygiene. A lot of teachers would argue that that's not appropriate instruction for a kindergartner who needs to learn all the different core competencies that California sets forth. Meanwhile, someone from the culture would argue that preparing a good citizen is really what education is about. And culturally responsive teaching means that you meet these kids where they are, understanding empathetically and sympathetically how to actually help them get where you'd like for them to go, but addressing the needs that they have. And so, for instance, if tying shoes is something that they haven't acquired, taking instructional time is appropriate for that group because you've done something to elevate them toward better citizenship. So culturally responsive teaching takes in consideration things that, like their prior experience, clearly they hadn't had prior experience doing basic things like brushing teeth, tying shoes, basic hygiene. So those were things that they were taught in a kindergarten class. Our traditional model would go against that. Culturally responsive teaching says you are doing the right thing.
And you'll sometimes have groups of people who come into a formal education environment with very different ways of learning and different ways of knowing than what that environment is set up for. So part of culturally responsive teaching is understanding where those students are coming from and meeting them where they are, rather than saying, oh, well, they need to know this, this, and this. So we understand that students who feel unsafe in their learning environment, they feel unconnected with others, and they feel disrespected, are often unmotivated. They have problems with concentration. They have problems with willingness to continue, with retention. They're powerfully influenced by the respect they receive or don't receive from the people around them. And this affects everything, including, this is what the research shows that to me was very troubling, including their ability to trust their own thinking and experiences as having value. So, in other words, when they feel disrespected or unsafe, they're not only unmotivated, but they start questioning themselves and their fitness to be there. So that's obviously, especially at UCR, when our mission is absolutely to address a culturally diverse audience, that's something that is very troubling. And we want to make sure that they don't come away feeling this way.
Prior to our next slide, I also want to address an example of inclusion. So I gave you an example of culturally responsive teaching from my mother. In inclusion, I used to go to Cal State San Bernardino as an undergraduate. I was in a physical education program, and we actually did inclusive PE at the local elementary schools. So as an example, with inclusion, you literally had children with wheelchairs, crutches, and all kinds of different unique abilities physically included in physical activity. So your preparation for that physical activity took in consideration that there were certain things that they couldn't do. So the games that you set forth were games that they could all be participatory in. The benefit of that was that you saw kids who were completely able. One of the first things that you actually saw in them that was a benefit for them is that they had compassion and consideration. So if you think about now a classroom where you're trying to facilitate, or learners who you're trying to facilitate in inclusion and cultural competence, right? That kind of thing is elevated by having this student who's saying, I actually have value in this learner who's unique, and as I grow up, I'm going to model that kind of thing. So both your instruction has to be that way, but now you're modeling for your students and learners so they're likely to become more well-rounded and inclusive of other people, considerate of diversity, and that's what you're really trying to facilitate. I think we need a world like that. So as an example of inclusion, structuring lessons that include everyone and how unique they might interface with the information and materials is critical.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit before we dive into some of the specific strategies about something called the blame cycle. So consider, I'm just going to use an example as a way of illustrating what this is. So we'll consider an example between a teacher and a learner where there is a problem over required assignments. And the learner hasn't been turning them in, hasn't been doing well on the required assignments. So the normal way that most teachers would react is to try as best they can to help the struggling learner. And the way that they would do that, the teacher really does at the top of the cycle, really does want to help. That's their goal. And so their normal behavior would be to give advice on how the learner might do better. So something like, hey, just keep trying. You know, sometimes it takes just a little more effort. And have you ever considered outlining the readings so that you can look at the main points a little more clearly?
So on the flip side, as a learner, with that kind of feedback, think about what happens. The learner is often unappreciative, frustrated, or withdrawn. The learner sees the assignment as irrelevant busy work, so they shrug off the advice on how to improve performance. When the learner shares this thinking on the assignment, the teacher has little empathy. So as an example, here is how the learner feels. I really don't see the point of the assignment.
Well, if you just spend a little bit more time on it, I'm sure you'll do just fine. How about trying to spend about an extra 30 minutes a day on these assignments? So the teacher's further efforts to increase mutual feelings of incompetence. The student feels incompetent that they're not doing well in the class. The teacher feels incompetent because I keep giving advice, but it's not helping the learner. And there's a kind of a sense of helplessness that this isn't helping what we're doing. And the teacher does a lot of what a lot of us do when our efforts don't seem to be bearing fruit. We double down on the advice that we're giving. That's what most people do, right? So because the learner's performance still isn't improving, both the teacher and the learner now feel incompetent and very frustrated. So, you know, have you even tried outlining the chapters the way that we discussed? That would be a good way to do better on these assignments. I know it takes a little more effort, but it really would greatly enhance your assignments.
So at this stage, you can see the back and forth starts to create both a teacher and a learner who can potentially be blameful of one another, and it lowers motivation. So now, not only does it lower motivation, it lowers your expectations of one another. Mm-hmm. The learner is not expecting the teacher to understand and help them get further along the learning cycle. The teacher is expecting the learner to give more effort and feels like the learner's effort, if only the effort increased, and you've heard this a million times, then you'd be better at what's going on. So now, here is the learner's perspective on this. Wow, is she a terrible teacher? These assignments are worthless and a total waste of my time.
So when we get into this sort of mutual blame cycle, self-fulfilling prophecies start happening. Does that make sense? Yes. So now I'm thinking, you know, I've now started to lower my expectations of what this learner is capable of because, look, I've given advice and he hasn't taken my advice. So I stop expecting much of him. And we all know, if you've done any teaching, you know that self-fulfilling prophecies happen in the classroom. There's a lot of research to show that if you expect less of students, they do perform less, regardless of their abilities. So now both the learner and the teacher have these self-fulfilling prophecies of each other. You know, you just can't help some of these learners. No matter what I do, they just ignore your advice. Then they can't understand why they're failing, but I keep telling him what to do, and he just keeps ignoring it.
And this stage of the interaction actually creates hostility. And so when you think about learners who are experiencing this primarily in this scenario, you're actually mounting the hostility that the learner has toward both the instructor, but you can turn them off to learning the content, period. So from the learner's perspective, here's how they see the teacher. Unfair, uncaring dictator.
Lazy, unmotivated, entitled. That's where labels start coming into play. And we become more and more entrenched in our positions towards the other. So now the teacher and the learner start withdrawing from the situation, becoming very hostile. They start focusing on stereotypes and generate ill will towards one another. Now, if this seems extreme and my examples seem extreme, just listen sometime to students when they talk about classes that they're struggling in and talk about the teachers in those classes. And then walk over to the faculty lounge and listen to those faculty members talk about the learners that are struggling in their class. And usually you'll hear exactly this kind of blame cycle and labeling going on. Well, I can't do anything with these learners. They're, these millennials, they're so entitled, etc. Blame is both a consequence of this, and it's also a catalyst for what's going on. That you see that each person is mirroring each other's bad behavior, and they're not listening to one another, and they're not really trying to hear or see from the other person's perspective. Now let's reframe this blame cycle into something a little more positive. So how do we do that? So I'm going to use a different example here because we've beaten that example to death. But this is a blame cycle at work, and let's consider how reframing it might work. So an instructor has a student that keeps blurting out things in class. They're very aggressive. They aren't called on, but they keep jumping into the conversation. And the teacher feels like they're being very aggressive. And so the first thing to do is recognize what your interpretation of the situation is. They have this student and they keep talking out of turn. I think that I'm seeing this as aggression. And then create an alternative interpretation to what's going on. So say something like, well, I'm seeing it as aggression, but perhaps it's something else. What might it be that someone keeps jumping in?
Passion.
Passion for the topic. What else could it be? The more I ignore someone, the louder they get in class. I'm trying to ignore them because they're disruptive. And the more I ignore them, the more they talk. What might that be? That might be a situation where someone feels like they're not being acknowledged and not being heard. It might just be passion for the topic. They're just excited.
But it could be a need for attention.
It could be a need for attention. It could be a cultural difference. My family, I come from an Italian background, and nobody takes turns. Everybody talks over everybody else. It's just. I told my husband that if he didn't jump into the conversation, he'd never get a word in because nobody waits. So perhaps it's just a culture difference. Perhaps it's passion for the topic. Perhaps it's just a need to be heard. So then of those alternatives, what seems to be a plausible alternative interpretation of what's going on? And we can sort of then describe that new interpretation, which in this case we'd say, well, you know what? I'm seeing this as aggression, but it might actually just be passion for a passionate engagement in learning. And now, of course, if I reframe it as something else, I'm going to act very differently towards that learner when I try to see if there's ways I can curtail the disruptive nature of what's going on and try to bring it from an understanding point of view. These are your sense.
Thank you. I was ready. So, Dr. Tyrrell, in preparing this, first and foremost, I want to thank her because this is a learning experience for me. And every time I get a chance to teach, of course, when you tell your learners how to know whether they've learned something effectively, you tell them to do what? Teach. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she gave me an assignment. I know that she didn't intend for it to be an assignment, but when someone sends you information that they feel is valuable and takes the time to find information and share that information with you, then you engage it. So she sent me a phenomenal article. And initially I was reading the article and I was like, this is just really cool. And then I was like, it's so relevant to the topic. So I'm going to distill this into a few slides and tell you what I gleaned from the article and how it applies to what we're doing. So basically, the first set of content that I want to share is about the 4 elements of professional learning about race and equity. Because of course, if you're talking about inclusion, you'd have to be thinking about race. And one of the areas where we actually fall short in America with interactions is with race majorly and gender. So watch what is suggested about just 4 professional elements of learning about race and equity. Make sure you do a comprehensive and systematic focus on the whole school. So if you're trying to teach her, it would be a whole program, right? Or your whole grand round learners for physicians. Think about the whole group, not just particular groups. So as an example, you guys have different specialties. You wouldn't prepare grand rounds unless they were actually targeted just for family medicine. I'm sure there's times when that occurs, but if you had grand rounds that you opened to all of your physicians, and let's say your PGY 1s through whatever program they're in, and that might be 7 or 8, but I know it's at least 3 or 4. You're going to tailor your content to that whole group. You're not going to single out particular learners. So let me give you a concrete example that you've all experienced. You went to school, most of you went to school at some point in your lives in America. If I've left you out, please forgive me. You'll understand this. There's this old model of teaching where either you really did all of your effort and tailored it towards your high-performing students, and you've seen this. And the teacher ensured that they challenged those students, they engaged those students, the pace of their lesson was suited to their students. Then you have the flip of that. You have the teachers who were really compassionate about the students who were left behind. And then they forgot to challenge the students who were high-performing students, so the whole class and group wasn't considered. You might have thought that when you were doing your lecture, but your behavior showed you way something different. And I've been in both of those classes. So in one of the classes, if you're a high-performing student, you're engaged the whole time, you love it, you're stimulated. The instructor is wonderful, just like the last scenario, but flipped. If you're one of those students struggling, now the last scenario works perfectly. The lecture was actually for, and the content was delivered for the high-performing students. And you're trying to catch up, but if you'd only work a little harder, you'd get it. And that reoccurring self-fulfilling prophecy shows that the whole class and the whole group wasn't the focus. The instruction was on and tailored toward a specific group. You've got to be very mindful of that. Next, willingness by participants to experience some level of discomfort. Most of us, unless we were taught to teach in front of groups very young, got uncomfortable the first time we got in a college course in communications and had to do a 3-minute speech, a 5-minute speech, and a 7-minute speech. So discomfort is something that you have to do anyway when you're in our positions. But the reality is, for the content that we're talking about, dealing with race, dealing with inclusion, dealing with diversity, we have to deal with that discomfort. So here's what's crazy. None of us made the country that we're in terms of how racist it is and all the problems that it has. But we've tacitly inherited a variety of things that we need to address. And so the discomfort that grandmama taught me to refer to particular groups in a particular way, that's wrong. We need to be comfortable with the idea that you're going to be discomforted, talking about it, putting it out there, but learning from it so that we actually benefit and progress from it. Third, willingness by participants to tell their own story about race. You've heard Dr. Tiro and I start to touch on some things, but I got a brother in the back who I played catch with, and we both played baseball. The reality is, baseball is considered an all-American sport. But you can see in a variety of different ways in which, and I'm literally using this as an example now of being able to be comfortable with talking about race. Baseball is not really embracive of all races. So much so to where I was in high school and my coach made racist jokes all the time. But because I was one of the few blacks on the team, we just accepted that. But what's crazy about it is we would be on buses, and because the coach was that way, it made it okay for the players to talk to each other that way. And it never stopped. As I went through college, I experienced the same thing. Even in pro ball, I experienced the same thing. And yes, I played professional baseball on the minor league level for 4 years. Different life, not a big deal. But in terms of an example of race, we have to be able to tell our stories and be honest with them and deal with the discomfort to address this. Last, recognition that discussions about issues rarely lead to a tidy sense of closure. So even tonight, even after giving you some strategies, you're not going to walk away feeling like we got this mastered. We're going to be the most culturally considerate and inclusive group when we teach, when we design our instruction, when we deliver that, we're going to be perfect. No, and there are going to be still things that you recognize as you move on where you're like, wait, why did we use that terminology? So now watch this example. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion advisor for Main Campus. I've been on that group for now almost 3 years. So now we actually have equity advisors, we build a program and everything else. But watch, one of our trainings brought this to my attention and I never knew. Have you guys ever heard this term, see you later? Watch this. I was told by a woman who was doing the training that there's actually a racial bias behind that term. And it comes from how Chinese were on the railroads and didn't speak English well, and so that's all they could say when they left. But dominant culture would use that as a slight, and it became a slang. Then it became a saying that we use, and it's far removed from the damage. But yet, I'd imagine, just like my wife is half Japanese and half Mexican, if you bring up things that her Japanese grandmother experienced with internment camps, she shuts down and it takes her back way far. So I'd imagine that using certain terminology that has been entrenched in American culture that has problems with race, we might want to inspect. So just being mindful that while we're having these conversations, there'll be things that you discover, even about the way in which we speak on a daily basis, that might be offensive that we had never realized, is an opportunity for us to both realize that this is not tidy, but we can change. And that was the point there. So let's go forward. Let's talk about 2 traps to avoid. Did you have a question? I missed you.
Let's back to the last point.
By all means.
Okay. You mentioned about, we need to be careful about some term in different culture,
Yeah.
if I understand correctly.
Yes, ma'am.
But the point is, if you look at other side, in this way we need to be silent all the time.
No.
So, yeah, we have to make sure it's not meaning that. Because in this way, I'm not sure, we are different,
Right.
everybody came from different culture, different
Right.
background,
Right.
and then you don't want to hurt somebody.
Right.
So then, can you, explore that part?
Yes, I don't think that you have to be
Perfect.
silent all the time. So what I would suggest as a strategy for dealing with it is be mindful. So the mindfulness would be also being receptive, that if someone tells you that was offensive, that you're receptive to hearing that and changing it, because you likely didn't know ahead of time, like the example that I gave, and there's many things that we do of that nature. Now, let's say, for instance, you could actually read someone's intentionality, which is not always easy, but let's say that you could. If someone is malicious about their intent with language use, then you still need to address it. But when it's an accident and you can tell that, or at least feel that, the nicest way to deal with this would be to say, that's somewhat offensive. It comes from
point.
this background.
Good point.
And then you have the opportunity to change.
Yes, that one is good point. But sometimes some people, I'm going with her that we are friends.
Right.
Maybe she not telling me at all.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
You know? So then this is something that in practice, yes, it's good on that journal, we can put on the PowerPoint, but it's good to think about something that is practical.
Okay,
That's it.
Practical.
And I love it. And I think,
I guess-
and I'll let Dr. Tyrrell jump in.
I love to hear
Yeah.
something that is
Practical.
practical, and I like to hear from everybody else.
Yes,
too.
please.
I definitely have some tips and strategies that we're going to talk about.
Oh, perfect,
Mhm.
perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll keep that in
Yeah,
mind.
that's good.
Okay.
That's a good point.
It is. So let's talk about a couple of traps to avoid, and then actually have some tips as well. So we'll both give some tips. Defensiveness and comparing oppressions. The example is there, but I'll just say this. You'll have situations where people will hear someone else sharing an oppressed experience that they've had and feel like they have to meet that with a similar story. And the one thing that it does is oftentimes people feel like their experience wasn't validated, and there was this need to actually show that you've had similar types of experiences that only make that interaction more of like, now we're on this been oppressed talk too. And so think about that. It would be like someone coming and sharing that they've had a bad experience and they can clearly see that they were discriminated against. And the first thing that our response is an example of us being discriminated against as well. And it's not because we were trying to be supportive, but it often sounds like you're trying to say that you're in the same club of discrimination. And so I think that it can become a trap that actually triggers defensiveness in the mind of the individual who's sharing their experience and feeling like the other party is trying to show that, in fact, there's some level of defensiveness as well, because they have to share that I've been oppressed as well, instead of hearing and understanding where you've been and what your experience is like.
And it's also, I think that sometimes, especially in the scenario you're talking about, when people do it, it isn't their intention to try to top you
Right, right.
or to not be sensitive, but they're trying to show empathy by saying, "Oh, I understand because this has happened to me," but that's not how
What
it
it does.
reads to
Exactly.
the person that you're saying it to. It reads like I'm saying, "Oh, well, I can top that. I had the worst story."
Right.
And then you get into this, we're the most oppressed group. It's not a competition,
Exactly.
right?
Dr. Gerald, that was perfect. Thank you so much. The other area that's a major trap to actually avoid is guilt, fear, and anxiety. And you can feel that bubble up in uncomfortable conversations about race and gender. So the long history of discrimination toward poor children and children of color in our schools can elicit guilt for folks who realize they benefited from a system designed to help them at other people's expense. And that's actually a harsh
I know she didn't say
reality.
white guilt on that, but that's a term that I've heard many times.
And it is true. And it wasn't actually stated in the article, but that is an example of it. So before I go forward, because I did not acknowledge that last time, are there any comments or questions before we go into some tips? You guys rock. So we'll go into some tips, but we're going to talk about principles of interracial facilitation, because that actually does provide you the tips, right? So principle 1, interracial facilitators must be strategic in deciding who does what. Notice that this is interracial facilitation. That was one of the things that actually really made the article hit home. So one of the tips was to ensure that not only do you have a concrete plan ahead of time, but you have someone who would be more diverse lead and close, and we're both diverse. But this is a perfect opportunity for a woman who's been from very disadvantaged backgrounds and similar experiences to lead, and she's got a story, but from a black male who's worked with her, and we've literally worked through a variety of different things. And so right now is a perfect example. I was going to use this later on, but I'll use it now. So I've known Rosemary the entire time. I had the luxury and honor of hiring Rosemary. So we would go around and do these wonderful LACE, because LACE is one of the programs that we have. If you don't know about it, ask us offline. It's an amazing program. But we would go and do these, they were information sessions, because we called it faculty development until we got Dr. Tyrrell. It was not faculty development. We'd be sharing some content about, well, this is what we do. This is how we evaluate. And we would ride together. And lo and behold, and watch this story, because this is perfect for this. We would ride together and talk about world issues. We're both passionate about the mission of the medical school. We care about the community. And politics came up. And I know my daddy told me never talk about religion and politics with folks. But the reality is, based on all the other slide presentations before this, that's the kind of stuff that makes a little discomfort arise. Have you engage in real conversations? And so we challenged each other. And at first I was like, man, girl, I'm from the inner city. I was born in LA. Man, politics aren't about black males. They're not about black people or minorities, period. They don't give a damn about us. So I don't vote half the time. And man, that's all I had to say. Do you know, for at least 3 rides, that sister would slide in why I needed to actually exercise my civil liberties and how vote. And come on, my mom's a teacher. So I've heard a lot of this. Brothers and sisters and abolitionists and all these other people who care about humanity died. Sweat, blood, tears behind marching and everything else to try to give us these rights. How dare I say, from my cultural experience, I don't think it gives a damn about me. And therefore participating is an interesting thing. But we kept engaging in that conversation. I voted because Dr. Tyrrell was on me. And that beautiful exchange is exactly what we're getting at. And so I had to tell that story this time because I thought it was appropriate. Here's another principle. Interracial co-facilitators must model vulnerability. We're sharing vulnerable stories. Some of you we've interacted with and had beautiful relationships with and known for a while. Some of you are new to this. So we're vulnerable. I don't even know Mike. We connected. He's probably doing homework back there, but mom made him come. Now, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, brother, but the point of the matter is I just made him vulnerable because we're vulnerable to you as an audience. But the reality is, in these interactions in the world that we're in, we are vulnerable. There's a time when you actually expose that and allow that to help you all grow. And that's what this is about. So, facilitators must own their own role in perpetuating or promoting institutionalized practices that perpetuate inequities, like some of our language use, maybe not saying see you later. However, doing this publicly allows the idea that everyone carries certain biases to be realized by the group. We all have them. There's a time at which you go through life, every single one of you, and even if you're not pediatricians, you know babies aren't reasoning for a long time. We even philosophers, and I've got 2 degrees in philosophy, we call it the age of reason for a reason, right? At some point, magically, you become more self-aware such that you're able to do things. Prior to then, you've been fed a lot of stuff, so you're gonna have biases that didn't come from you. But we've got to deal with it and do something to change it. Principles of interracial facilitation. Discomfort is identified as one of the norms of conversations about race. Get comfortable with it. Discomfort is normal when you're talking about racial issues in a place where we use them so divisively, and yet we're one family. Discomfort is inevitable for all of us when dealing with topics about race and equity, which touch on culture and inclusion. It's important as facilitators to demonstrate how to confront one another in productive ways, which was your question, Dr. Jafari. How to literally confront one another with issues that would be offensive, that weren't considerate, but in productive ways that allow the conversation to continue, for each of us to grow and learn from it and not be so wounded that we actually shut down.
Good point, but again, there are a lot that we don't know, like that example that you already mentioned.
Yeah. And I
So
think, but
then that one is something that
But watch.
I don't have answer.
that example actually is a good example of an answer, right?
That's it.
Because watch, all of us in the room had never heard of that example.
That's it, perfect.
But now we
question.
share it
Exactly, and there are a lot of...
and may not use that terminology anymore.
That's it. Right now, another day I was in the airport, and you know how many different, culture, background, race live in a city of Irvine.
Right.
Exactly. And each of them, I don't want to change, I know
No,
you
you're
have
fine,
a lot
you're
of
good, you're good.
right to talk. But then, definitely in each culture, background, there are something that we don't know that we don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
So then that part,
Coral, what you don't know, you don't know. I love
Another good
that.
example of this is the expression rule of thumb.
Yeah.
How many people have used that expression? Well, as a rule of thumb, I do this or that. Well, some people know that historically the rule of thumb was that a man could beat his wife as long as the stick he used wasn't any wider than his thumb. That was actually the rule of thumb. So that expression is one that a lot of people don't even realize that history exists. But once you do know it, then just sort of being mindful that maybe that's not an expression that we want to be using is another example. And again, there's it's not, you can't draw a line and say, now I've learned everything I need to know. It's a constant learning and growing process over time where you start learning new things and you're a little more mindful and more aware. So yeah, I don't like flare up if somebody says rule of thumb. I just assume they don't know the history behind it, right? So but I don't use that term anymore.
The same to me. If it's something that I feel is offended me in my culture or my background or the place I grew up, I never offended because I'm thinking, she doesn't know.
Right.
That's it.
I'm not going to assume
So
that you knew the history and you
personalities
used it
like that.
anyway.
But that example was something that, I was thinking if everybody wanted to think like that, it's a little bit hard.
So I'll do it this way. I want to do two things. One, I love Dr. Tyrrell's example of rule of thumb, so let's replace the one I gave with that one. Two, here's the 2 tips that I would give right now without foreshadowing too much, and I know they're one of the tips. One of the biggest things that we can do is listen. Because hearing someone's story genuinely, so you were sharing that There's a variety of different things that should someone say it that may be culturally offensive, you don't get offended because you know they may not know. But some people do. And so for those individuals who get offended, we have to listen. That's the first thing. That's the biggest tip. Now watch what's a byproduct from that.
I agree with that part.
The next one's an L as well. Learn. So I'm a cognitive dude. I'm a psychologist. Learning is literally a change in behavior and or cognitions. So if you listened and they gave you information that was valid, important, valuable, then the thing that has to happen from that is that you learned, which means there was something that changed in how you both think and hopefully behave. And those are the two biggest tips I could give you. There'll be more tips, and there's always strategies we can use to deal with difficult situations. We can't, and my biggest thing would be never back out of them unless it's going to be conflict or things are going to go awry.
Into it.
So learning strategies that just help us listen empathetically and sympathetically and then learn from that situation, to me, are two of the biggest strategies we could have. And I hope that's at least somewhat helpful.
One of the things I wanted to talk about is perception, because this is an issue directly related to what we're talking about. I used to work in a bank in a different life, and we were trained, of course, in what to do if the bank is robbed. Obviously, it's a situation that everybody who works in a bank has to address. And the first thing that they told us to do is when the bank is robbed, after you've called the police and shut the place down, is nobody talks to anyone else. That's the rule. You all go into your own little corner and wait for the police to arrive. Why is that, do you think?
You want to share stories because you might change your story by what someone else tells you.
That's it.
Right, because everyone, the tellers, the loan officers, the manager, they all saw the robbery from a different perspective, and they all saw something different. But if we start chatting about it, then pretty soon it's like, oh, I thought he was wearing a red hat. Oh, I thought it was a blue hat. And pretty soon the stories all start to become familiar. So a lot of times we think we see the reality of a situation, when really what it is our perception of that reality, right? So let's talk about some specifics. Oh, before I go on, I just wanted to acknowledge that in some of my slides, you'll be seeing this, there are people with words painted on them, on their hands and on their back. And this comes from a very worthy art project called the I'm Tired Project, which utilizes photography, the human body, and written words to highlight lasting impact of everyday microaggressions, assumptions, stereotypes, and all the things we're talking about. It reveals thoughts and feelings that person has felt many times but never said, and now it's painted on their back. So people often don't voice these because they're afraid of fear, they're afraid of backlash, they're afraid that they won't be relatable and people won't get it. So that's where these images came from. So tip number one, of course, is recognize your bias and stereotypes. So wait. I can hear what you're thinking. I don't have any biases. I'm a fair person. I treat everyone fairly. How dare you say that I have biases? Well, sadly, it's part of our human nature to have biases, right? We have in-group and out-group biases. It's hardwired into our DNA as a survival skill, because those people that look like us, they're members of our tribe, and those other people that don't look like us, they're more of a threat because they're from a different tribe. So that's human nature. We all have it. We all have these biases within us. And we have this tendency, and refusing to admit that you have this tendency can cause some real damage, because you then won't be mindful about the biases that you might have and how they're impacting your teaching. So we have to recognize that we probably do have some biases. We need to be reflective and consider what those biases might be and look for ways to address them. And keep in mind that we're not always talking about negative biases. They can also be positive biases. So what do we mean by a positive bias? Can someone give me an example of a positive bias?
All Asian people are smart.
All Asian people are smart. In the medical community, I hear a lot of people saying, female healthcare workers are more empathetic than male healthcare workers. How many people have heard somebody say that at one point in time? Yeah, I see lots of nodding. And you may think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, any biases are going to affect your teaching, and they're going to cause damage. Even if you might frame that as a positive thing I'm saying about my female students and learners, it's still a stereotype, and it can still do damage to your learning environment. So, to be aware of it. I noticed something, and I shared this story, and I don't know if I should share it here, but your thing about how we should share our own stories makes me want to share it. So this was happened to me years ago. I was telling a story, and the story was about being confident because I'd walking down the street and a car pulled up and asked me for directions, and I wasn't 100% sure of the directions, and I told the guy, I think, it's this way. And then a young man on a bicycle came by, and he asked him, and he was very confident, and he gave him directions, and the driver drove off in the wrong direction. My directions turned out to be right, and the other gentleman's directions turned out to be wrong. So the reason I was relating this story was because it was just about, how I was right, but I lacked so much confidence. That was what the story was about. But I recognized every time I told the story, I would say, and a black guy rode up on a bicycle. I didn't identify the race of the driver. So what does that mean? The driver was what? White, right? And I realized after telling that story a few times, why was I identifying the ethnicity of the guy on the bicycle? It wasn't relevant to the story. And obviously I was sort of framing it as the other, right? So why was that even included? And I recognized that I was doing that. So just recognizing those kinds of things and being reflective about them and mindful about why did I do that? Why did I feel that was an important part of the story? It isn't. And I caught myself doing it. So how many people have heard colleagues say millennials are what? What have you heard them say? Not you, of course. Nobody in this room would ever say anything bad. But you've heard other people say millennials are? Come on. Lazy. What else? Entitled. What else? Short attention span. Anything else you've heard people say about millennials? I've heard lots more than that. I've heard faculty say it many, many times. And millennials are entitled, spoiled, distracted, needy. They want a trophy just for showing up. They're lazy. They don't want to work for what they get. I've heard faculty say these things many, many times. This is one of the places where I see a lot of bias that we kind of shrug off, and that's age bias. Imagine if you were using these terms to describe an ethnic minority, how offensive that would be. But yet somehow we think it's okay to use it for an age cohort. I would also argue that probably our students who fall into a certain age cohort may not be entirely representative of their age cohort, because they're probably, different in that they were high performers and that they, sought out medicine, so they're not representative. And we don't really want to label in this way any group, including age groups. And that's where I most often see where people do it without thinking that there's anything wrong with it. So what are some of these instructional strategies we keep talking about? I want to talk first about, and some maybe seem more obvious than others, but let's unpack them and see what we come up with. So first, let's look at some ways that we related to content, the way that you present content to your learners. In your packet, there is a little survey that I'm not going to ask you to share with anybody. I'd like you to take it out and just do the content portion of it. Don't do the rest. We're going to do those at different times. But if you don't have pens, we've got pens we can give you. And just do those first ones. And you'll see that there's instructions at the top about checking them. You use a check mark if it's something that you use, or a little wiggly line if you sort of do, or X if I don't do it, or a star if I would really like to start doing it. Is there anybody who wants to do it who doesn't have one of the surveys? Okay. May I steal your... packet, yeah, because I find it helpful for me to have one to refer to. See some people nodding, which I hope means, yes, I do that. That's good. Thank you. Were any of these surprising to you? Did you see any that you thought, I've never thought of that before? Can you give me an example?
Deliberately choose course materials with a range of student physical abilities. I don't think I do that.
Yeah. Anything else that surprised you or made you kind of think for a minute? I'll tell you the one that's challenging for me is 2, which is using visuals that don't reinforce stereotypes. Because I can tell you, if you Google doctor and you want to use that as an image in one of your PowerPoint slides when you're doing faculty development at a medical school, it's like a sea of middle-aged white men. It's really not easy to find diverse representations when you Google the words, medical school or doctor. It's almost always white folks. I have personal experience with this. It's challenging to find diverse representations. I'm always asking Ross to send me more pictures of our students so that I can use them because we have diverse students represented. I think that another one that I think is was really interesting to me was including the author's full name instead of just initials to deal with gender diversity and acknowledging that some of these authors might be female. I was just today working on test questions for an online class that I'm going to be teaching, and I will tell you what I've done, and I've done this for many years, is when I'm using examples, and I like to do scenarios, so Professor so-and-so, I use a random name generator, and I just go down the list and use the names off that list so that I'm not constantly saying, Mary, Susan, Jane, so that there's a wider range of diversity represented in the names that I use. So I get to put in, Professor Mendoza or something rather than just what would have popped up in my own thinking. So that's useful, by the way, a random name generator. It can help you just sort of start sprinkling different names into your examples and test questions and things like that. So think about exclusive language that you might be using. So do you use terms of equal weight when referring to parallel groups, men and women, rather than men and ladies? Hopefully nobody does that anymore. But do you always use the male gender first? So is it always men and women, boys and girls, or do you occasionally say women and men, girls and boys? Think about that. I think a lot of people just say men and women without even thinking about it. Why is it that men always come first in that example? Do you use he and she during lectures, discussions, and in writing and in examples? Do you use refrain from remarks that make assumptions about your student's background and history? So socioeconomic backgrounds. I learned this. Not all students are busted broke like I was when I was a student. I had a student who was showing her new car and she was showing it around and I said, oh, let me see. It was a Mercedes. I was driving like this beat up old, motor scooter. So you can't assume. You don't know what their backgrounds are. On the other side, not all students can afford to do some things which may seem natural to the person teaching. I can't tell you how many faculty I've heard talk in their class about how important it was to travel without seeming to ever recognize that travel might be out of the reach of some of your learners. Not everyone has the resources to travel all around the world. So that, something like that. Family background, another area where you sometimes hear faculty say things like, now, back when your parents were in college, oops, sorry, first generation, my parents did not go to college. Or sexual orientation, usually with the assumption that your students are heterosexual, so you can bring your girlfriend to the holiday party, or, even in examples, always using heterosexual couples in examples. Familiar relationships, are you going to visit your parents over the holiday? At the risk of oversharing, I'm going to give you a personal example of this. So when I started my doctoral program at UCLA, the very first major assignment was called the leadership story. And this was supposed to be about all the influences in your life that led you to be the leader you now are. And I kind of skimmed past my childhood. It was both a major paper, like lengthy. It was both a written and an oral presentation. And I kind of skimmed lightly over my childhood, and the professor nailed me on it and kept writing comments. You need more here, you need more here, you need more here. And so I put it all in. When I had to do the presentation, I had to sit in the room and listen to all of my cohort members, one after another, sing praises of their family and how supportive their parents were and how wonderful their childhood had been. And I had to get up, and my first opening line was, my childhood was a Gothic novel. And again, to assume that everybody in the room has these like warm, fuzzy Ozzie and Harriet stories, which again, I just made the mistake of using a cultural reference that probably almost no one in this room got, because I'm older than everybody in here. But these sort of warm, fuzzy family feelings, that's an assumption you can't make. Some people don't have those stories. Right? Some people have stories they're not quite ready to share. And I even told the people I was sharing with in my cohort, this is usually a third date kind of thing. I don't usually open with this information. So I felt very exposed and had been sort of forced into exposing very personal details about my background that I wasn't really ready. So whenever I teach, if I'm asking people to write about or do anything that is of a personal nature, I always say, when I'm asking people to share at whatever level is comfortable for you. And I always warn people in advance that they're going to be asked to share. So we're going to do this writing assignment. You will be asked to share, but you don't have to share everything that you wrote. You can just share it to whatever level is comfortable with you. And sometimes students would just pass entirely, and that's okay too. Because if they're writing something personal, maybe they don't want to be forced to share it with everyone. So are you using variety in your case studies and examples? Are people trying to read what it says on his back? I see a lot of squinting. It says, I'm tired of my intelligence being associated with my ethnicity. That's what he's written on his back there. So I you know, when you give examples, do you inherently gender the examples? So a doctor is always he and a nurse is always she. I was in a class where an instructor talked a lot. She was an expert in ethnic diversity. But whenever she gave an example, it was gendered. It was gendered. So she was always saying, whether you some guy who's the principal at the school or a cleaning lady, always the male was in the leadership position and the female was in some lowly position in all of her examples. And I pointed out to her, she didn't apologize, she didn't acknowledge it was a problem. So just because you may be culturally sensitive in one area doesn't mean you might not have a blind spot in another area. Because that bothered me, because she did it all the time. And so sometimes you don't need to gender identify at all in an example. You could just make the same point about the difference between a leadership position and a lesser position by saying something like whether or not you run the school or just work there. And who uses the term cleaning lady anymore? I mean, really, seriously. That is kind of offensive anyway. You also have to evaluate how you are evaluating and whether your evaluation methods are inclusive. So research shows that instructors tend to evaluate positively students who question assumptions, speak out in class, challenge authority, challenge points of view, and actively participate. They tend to favor them in evaluations. Yes? I'm a teacher myself. We love those students that are always jumping in and challenging us and mixing it up with us. However, there's a problem in that that kind of evaluation reinforces privilege. If you've never thought about it, think about it. It's easy to question authority when you come from a background of privilege. It's not as easy if you don't. There are no consequences if you're from privilege. But if you're not, there are consequences for challenging authority, for being slapped down. It's easy to say you want to hear from everybody, but do all students feel equally comfortable speaking out? Some students have learned from bitter experience not to speak out and to sort of stay below the radar screen. So, you know, that gay kid who spoke up in high school was also beat up after class. They learned, right, not to speak out and to keep a low profile. Then they get into higher ed and we're penalizing them on their grades for that very thing, right? So some students were brought up to believe that challenging authority is rude and disrespectful. I had a faculty member who would frequently do it. He played devil's advocate and was just teasing the students to challenge him. So he'd say things like, you know, the Nazis did a lot of really good things. Now, he didn't mean that. He just said it to be provocative and to get people to push back. But in some cultures, they would consider it very disrespectful to challenge the teacher and say the teacher was wrong in what they were saying. So again, you're doing something for maybe what you think is a good pedagogical reason, but without thinking about the fact that not all students in the class may interpret what you're doing in the same way. And whether, what are you doing to make sure that students who are more reluctant are made comfortable and feel safe contributing? What are some ways you can engage those students without putting them in the spotlight? You can use a lot of little techniques where they get to talk amongst themselves in small groups, or one-on-one conversations with you before or after class, creating a climate where all views are respected and actively praised, especially when differing perspectives come in. Back in the day, I taught critical thinking among other things, and I can tell you from teaching it that a critical thinking class where there's no debate is like the most boring subject you could ever have. But because a preponderance of students, usually in higher ed, are usually left-leaning, if a conservative student were to speak out in class, they'd get like pounced on by all the other students. And then they never want to speak up again. And too bad, because having that sort of left-right debate is what makes critical thinking fun and interesting and forces people to examine their viewpoints and all that good stuff you want to get out of critical thinking. So making sure that you're creating a climate where that student, maybe in the minority, in this case politically, isn't getting pounced on and shouted down. Very important. And also, don't assume that you have a shared cultural literacy. As you age, you may discover that you and your students share fewer and fewer cultural touchstones and references. Literary, historical references, metaphors, analogies. Don't think they'll understand all your pop culture or historical references. Age is a very big factor in this. I've seen so many professors cling to the same examples that they've used for 25 years. Likening something to a Vietnam protest, for example, may go right over your student's head. You might as well be talking about the War of 1812. I mean, it's really just not part of their reality. So it is those kind of references you need to think about how you update them. So now I want you to go back to your little handout and do the next section, which is on instructional practices. And this is a little bit longer, and in the interest of time, I may cut you off before you're done. You can always finish it later, but at least start it. I don't know if anybody's gotten to the end, but I think that last one on anonymous grading methods isn't practical for a medical school, but there are situations where it can be useful. Writing classes, for example, you can have people turn things in and, with codes so you don't know who's who. One of the research studies that I always find fascinating is when symphonic orchestras went to blind auditions, the number of women getting jobs in symphonic orchestra went straight through the roof. So how do you do a blind audition? You just put a screen up, because all they need to do is listen to the music. They don't need to actually see the person who's playing that instrument. Right, they put a screen up. Yeah, but we're talking about musical instruments. So the numbers skyrocketed when they started blind auditions. And you see that reflected now in orchestras that are a lot more diverse than they used to be. I think that one of the ways to avoid using all this non-relevant examples is right here in the list, which is to ask the students to provide examples, because then you're going to get a lot of variety and diverse examples. So also I like the one that's about asking students for concrete observations about content before you go into analytical questions, so that everybody kind of starts in a level playing field where I'm just asking you to describe something that you see or things of that nature, so that everybody can kind of start from the same place. And there was one here too that said allow time because it helps English language learners or something. Oh, I guess that's avoid giving verbal instructions without a written corollary. I also thought about students with ADD who maybe won't be able to remember what you said 5 minutes ago. Always have a written version of instructions. Don't just explain it. I can't tell you how many faculty members I've seen do that, where they'll you write it, toss it off, and then they say, oh yeah, they know what they're supposed to do. And I'm like, then I get the students in my office saying, I have no idea what I was expected to do in the class. So one of the things that we want to do is incorporate the lived experiences of our learners. Don't assume that you know what that experience has been for them. Include all voices. So when you ask prompt questions, this is a big one, and I see it every time I observe teaching, every time. When you ask a prompt question, do you ask the question of everyone in the room? How do you ensure that you are actually including everyone? How many times when you ask that question is it the same 2 or 3 learners who put their hands up and respond? Be honest, how often does that happen? A lot, right? All the time. Because as teachers, we love having Hermione in class because it's awkward if you're standing there and you ask a question and everybody's looking at their shoelaces and nobody wants to answer the question. So you're happy for that one student's like, ooh, pick me. But the problem is that you're not including everyone's voice if you only rely on them. So usually when you toss it out to the group at large, only a handful of people respond. Encourage a range of opinion. Do you keep asking the prompt question over and over again until you hear a different point of view represented? That's another technique that is useful. Do you consider taking a few responses before you jump in and respond to what they just said? So I always tell instructors, think of it as the rule of 3. If I ask a question, I usually try to get at least 3 answers before I comment on what anyone has said. So usually, if the first person who answers says the thing you wanted to hear, then you jump in, good answer! And the rest of the students are left without any opportunity to voice their viewpoint, right? So can you sort of incorporate the rule of 3 and get a few more responses before you jump in? How are you encouraging the more introspective and quiet students to share? Some techniques to include them. You never want to put anyone on the spot and ask them like a knowledge-based question because they might not know the answer, right? But there's lots of questions you can ask that anyone can answer. Have you ever experienced, what happened the last time you went to your physician? How long did you have to wait? You can toss the ball. I can't teach without this ball. I toss it around the room all the time because it's a way of sort of doing the rule of 3 too, of tossing it to one person and asking them to toss it to someone else and someone else, right? So there's, use it for opinions, or maybe it has more than one right answer. Sometimes all you have to do is say, well, let's hear from somebody who hasn't shared yet, and just pull from people who haven't spoken up. So the next part of the survey is on instructor-student interactions. This is a big one, right? How you interact with your learners. So it's on the back of the survey. Take a moment and look at that section and fill that one out. Now, some of these are really obviously geared towards a more classic, traditional classroom environment where, you're meeting with the same learners week after week after week over a semester. So if you're just coming in and teaching 1 or 2 didactic lectures, some of these strategies aren't really relevant to you. I'd like to share also, I think I might have it in my slides, so if I do, I'll just skip over this slide. But I think it's really important that you learn to pronounce people's name correctly. And not all names come equally easy to different people's tongue, but it's important. And I've had students who, when I'm trying to call their name off the list, they jump in and they're like, just call me Susan, because they're so tired of hearing that. I had one student who I actually made her sit down with me in a conference room and teach me how to say her name, because I knew there wasn't a single other teacher at that institution who bothered to learn how to say her name. It was hard to say. So it is a challenge, and we are not all equally good at it, but it is something that I think is important. Also, it doesn't say this here, but I think I have it on one of my slides, which is trying to determine what pronoun they want to be used. So recognize the complexity and diversity. So, there's a lot of different issues. So we've talked about some of them. There's a lot of issues related to diversity. Students who are not traditional college age have different challenges than students who are and are living in a dorm or whatever. Freedom from religion is just as important to some people as freedom of religion. I had one participant in a similar workshop say to me, I know all my students are Christians. That was my face right there. And I said, how do you know that? I didn't have an answer for that. Perhaps you have someone who isn't a Christian in your group who is afraid if they self-identify, they'll now be judged negatively by you or by the other learners. People will sometimes say nothing, but that doesn't mean it's not bothering them. So heritage and tradition can be an important part of how people define themselves. Something as seemingly unimportant to one person, like a piece of jewelry, could have deep meaning to someone else. So I remember this conversation in the MEC about they were trying to put together a dress code policy. And that is a minefield of diversity issues that you have to be so careful. And I selected this image, this slide, for a very particular reason. If you can't read it, it says, I'm tired of being judged for not being married or having kids. Because women are often in an uncomfortable triple bind when it comes to childbirth. So if they have children in a career, they're criticized from some quarters for not putting their children first. If they have children and they give up their career to be stay-at-home moms, they're criticized from other quarters for embodying a stereotypical female role. And, sort of not keeping up the feminist flag, right? And if they don't have children at all, they're seen in some quarters as being incomplete or perhaps even selfish or self-centered. It's no win scenario. No matter what you do, you're going to get criticized for it from some quarters. So there's a lot of complexity to these issues. And this is the slide I was talking about. The concept of gender identity is rapidly evolving. I think it's faster than it has in any other time during my lifetime. Do we see this sort of evolving gender identity? And gender is a key part of someone's sense of self. So to incorrectly gender someone can cause that person to feel disrespected. And you can't always, as you know, visually identify someone's gender. It's not always immediately obvious. You can't always tell if someone's transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, gender variety, and so on. And if any of those terms are new to you, good, because it shows that you have some things to learn about the terminology that's now out there. And some people are now using non-traditional pronouns like Z. So, yes. So sometimes people will change their name or their pronouns during the time you know them because they might be going through some changes in gender during that period of time. Some people use more than one set of pronouns for themselves. They might feel comfortable with one set of pronouns in their personal life, but a different set in their work life. So so how do I know, with all of this going on, how do I know what the correct pronoun is to use? It's a minefield. I can't possibly know. Ask them. It's that simple. Ask them. Some of you may have gone to conferences lately where they've asked you to put your pronoun on your name tag. You can do that too. If you're using name tags in your class, you can ask the student to write the pronoun that they prefer on their name tag. Or if you're teaching in a clinical environment and they're wearing a name tag, you can ask them to add the pronoun they want to be used in that space on their name tag so you won't forget. And if you're not sure of what some of that is, I actually put a handout in here about pronouns that you can take a look at that will give you some ideas about where some of these pronouns are coming from. And it changes constantly. So, just ask, what is it that you want? And what if I accidentally make a mistake and you told me you wanted he to use, and I accidentally looked at you and said she? Big faux pas, what do I do now?
Throw up your papers and scream and yell. I said, I'm sorry.
Yeah, run from the room and apologize. Apologize. Say that you're working on it and you will try to do better in future. One of the things, don't make excuses. Excuses sounds like you're trying to put the blame on them for the fact that you made a mistake. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's just that there's so many new pronouns now. I just can't keep them all straight, right? Hello, I just have the one I wanted you to use, so most people just want an apology and a reassurance that you're going to try and do better. They appreciate your effort. And it's important to ask ourselves, do I interact with students in any way that may unintentionally manifest a double standard? So what I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you and share something that you have observed either in your work life or your educational life that you saw as a double standard. And if you're telling me you've never seen it, I don't believe you. So turn to someone and share. You see it in your work life or your education life? Maybe it wasn't you, maybe it was somebody you observed. You can partner with me. Well, what about Adam? The way he treated Kristen. Where it was more
Well,
easygoing.
that's a good point, because he would always
No, I don't.
treat me with respect, except one time, when he lost his temper with me, where he would flash on
But
somebody.
he routinely lost his temper with the female people.
Well, not just, but with younger people, and
Mhm.
fellows as opposed to carpenters.
So holding them to different standards.
So I think that's really kind of particularly they have to work on. So,
So share one of your examples if you're willing to share. You don't have to share if it's something you're not ready to share. If you have an example that you feel comfortable sharing,
Oh, yeah, Travis, you go.
I brought up the point of the dress code.
so in what way did you see that as a manifestation of a double standard?
I mean, I've seen a lot of it through like public schools. Females are sort of restricted as to what they can and can't wear because it might be a distraction to the classroom. But then I've seen cases where males have deliberately taken that like case where a female can't do it, but they do it and it's fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, even uniform, schools that use uniforms that force the girls to wear skirts and the boys get to wear pants.
Or shorts.
Or shorts, a double standard, right? So go ahead and toss that to a different team. You don't have anything? You don't have to share. You can always pass and toss it on to someone else.
Pass to me and then I can pass to somebody.
If you don't have an example.
Rosemary, you made me think about this example that recently occurred when you talked about when you Google images and you see the sort of typical image of a doctor. So one of the things that actually came light recently, because one of our students actually complained, so like in dermatology, when you see pictures of rashes, they're almost always with people with light skin. And one of our students who was dark skinned said, well, please show rashes of dark skinned people because they look actually really kind of different.
Right.
How else can you recognize that? So I immediately sort of thought about that and I said, that student is exactly correct. When you look at our dermatology sort of presentation, they're usually always people with lighter skin.
Yeah, an excellent example. And skin color issues are important because I don't know if you've been following the news, but Amazon is getting ready to sell to the government facial recognition software similar to the kind they use in China. And it's been shown that facial recognition software doesn't work with people with darker skin color. So it's inherently going to mess with a certain group of people. Right, so you've got that issue a lot of places.
But what if you are what if you're Caucasian and you go somewhere to Mexico, well, wherever, and you come back, we're all deep tan.
I don't know what happens then, but I know that it recognizes certain faces more easily than others, and skin tone is a part of that.
Skin tone.
Mm-hmm.
Skin tone.
Yep.
Is part of it.
Yeah. So if we go to only using facial recognition to get a check cashed or something like that, they've got to fix this technology before they go there. So go ahead and toss that ball to a different group.
Oh, what we're talking about. When
Terrible toss, by the way.
This is
Way to break down that male-female gender stereotype.
You were talking
That was a microaggression.
What's happening?
That was a microaggression. Yes, I'm sorry. You're right. It was.
I did not. funny you're not.
Okay.
That was good.
But we're taking Prescott too.
Well, I just thought of one. It's not
Mhm.
professional, but it's kind of personal. In our house with our kids, we say, "Don't use your cell phone at the dinner table." But then, when the kids are not there, me and my wife are using this. That's
A little bit of a double standard.
It's a very personal double standard that I don't think is that unique.
Yeah. Did you have another one? You started to say something, Anna.
Oh no.
She was like, you did start to say something, but you don't have to if you don't want to.
No, you know, it was kind of funny, it's sort of funny about skin tone. So when I was 7, I was going to be in this ballet thing with 200 other little girls. So my mother got the powder, white powder, and powder made from head to toe. And I didn't really understand that until in China, when if you're dark, that means you've been out in the rice field
Right.
and you're
So you're
lower.
working poor, right?
It's a class.
And if you weren't, if you were really white as a Chinese in China, then you were considered very rich.
Mhm. So there's a double I think we could probably unpack a lot more, especially in the workplace. I see it all the time. So, think about what impact those kind of double standards have on not just the person who's benefiting from it or the person who is disadvantaged by it, but on everyone in the learning environment. So obviously, any group label assumes an individual, and asking people to be representatives of their entire group is awkward and uncomfortable. I particularly notice this comes with cohorts and new generations of students, as we've already discussed. We're quick to label based on age. And I've even done workshops on, teaching Generation Z and I always try to talk about that is, yes, there are differences in generations because we were raised in very different cultures. But there's so understanding and understanding who this generation is important, but it's a very short jump from trying to understand the trends and tendencies to jumping over that dark line into now stereotyping and labeling. So we need to be very mindful of when we're doing that. I'm tired of too old and too young. Hearing that a lot in the recent political race, by the way. Convey the same confidence in all students is important. Research shows that instructors unconsciously base expectations of student performance on issues related to race, gender, language proficiency, socioeconomic status, and appearance. So I think that also you want to assess your own learning climate for issues related to this. So I heard someone say the other day, I know there aren't any issues like this with my students. And I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, because no one's ever said anything, right? And just, we cover that in the myths, right? Just because people seem happy and they aren't bringing it up doesn't mean that it's not there. So you need to assess specifically for this issue. So one way to do that is through some survey questions, hopefully in an anonymous environment. I know when you're dealing with a small group of learners, like in a clinical session, there's really no anonymity. It's like if I surveyed my staff, I have Anna and Kay, so I have a 50-50 chance of figuring out who it was that said it. It was either Anna or Kay, right? So when it's a small group, their anonymity kind of goes out the window. But if you do have some form of anonymity, you can ask the question, in what ways, if any, does your ethnicity, race, gender, religion, national origin, or identity affect your interactions with the instructor or your preceptor or other learners in this group? By asking that question. Even if they don't say there are any problems, just by asking the question, you're showing them how much this means to you and how you value the fact that everybody feels safe and included. Just by asking that question, even if you don't get any responses back. And I said this one already, it's not only unfair, but it's distasteful to ask one student to speak for an entire group, even if they're a member of that group. I can't speak for all women, nor can I speak for people of my age, nor can I speak for all Californians, nor people who are raised Catholic, nor for all people of Italian, Irish descent, etc., etc. I'm not a representative of those groups. And assumes that every member of a group is an authority on their group and that everybody in that group thinks the same way, right? Because if I'm representing all people within that group, then you're assuming that they all think exactly the way I think. The last one is the student-to-student interactions, and I'm going to have you do that one at home just because we're running short on time, and we have some case studies we wanted you to work on. So I'll just go through my tips, and you can do yours. You're looking at that either while I'm talking or after the workshop. So one is to use icebreakers, games, and collaborative learning, because we all know that when people get to know each other as human beings, some of these issues break down, right? Nothing breaks down bias faster than actually getting to know people, right? I can attest to this in my own life. My mother was, a pretty liberal person, but she had an extreme bias against homosexuals until we started bringing home friends. And when she got to know them, suddenly she was for gay marriage, and there was a whole turnaround, because something about meeting someone as a human being changes the way you think about that topic, right? So give learners a chance to get to know each other on a personal level. Establish ground rules in your learning environment. So why would I do this? Why would I say, okay, this is what's okay and this is what is not okay in my class or in our clinical environment? Why would I need to do that? Am I not just opening Pandora's box if I bring this up? No, why not?
People feel more secure if they know the limitations.
Right. Ground rules make students accountable for their behavior. They can prevent issues of incivility, because I said right up front it's not going to be tolerated. Learners understand more clearly the expectations, as well as the expectations for themselves and their classmates. And they can now hold each other accountable for things because you've made clear what's okay and what's not okay within that environment. Rules can create a safe environment for participants where everybody knows that their ideas will be represented. And just like that thing I said about asking the question, are you feeling okay in this environment? By setting up ground rules, and some people will put it right in their syllabus, you're sending a very clear message that you value this, that you want everyone to feel safe and included in your learning environment. And there's been some research done on this, and students have respond very positively to seeing these kinds of rules established in classroom environments. At another workshop, someone said, well, if we're overly sensitive to people's cultural identity in the learning environment, we aren't preparing our students for patience, who might be rude, they might be bigoted, they might be insensitive, and we're mollycoddling them, and then they go to these patients and they're dealing with all kinds of people. How would you respond to that? Well, it's true. They might be dealing with patients who are racists and misogynists and all sorts of horrible things. Does that mean that I shouldn't create a safe environment in the learning environment? Because I'm not preparing them for the real world? I know, it took me a while too. I actually didn't know what to say when this individual said it in the workshop, but I thought a lot about it after that. And it occurred to me that people from marginalized groups don't have to be taught what it's like to face a racist. They've been facing it their whole lives. What we're trying to do in our learning environment is to create an environment where everyone has an equal opportunity to learn and be successful, and not placing extra burdens on certain individuals that others do not have. Does that make sense? That's our role as educators. Yes, of course, in the real world, they're going to face racists, they're going to face sexism, they're going to face all kinds of things. But I don't know, speaking on behalf of someone who's been a woman her whole life, I don't need someone to explain to me what it feels like when someone treats you and diminishes you for your gender. I've experienced that many, many, many times. But I don't want to experience it in the classroom. I don't want to have to deal with that extra burden when I'm learning, right? So that was my thoughtful response. I didn't know how to respond to it in the moment, but I thought a lot about it after that.
Dr. Taylor?
Yes.
Did you want to share that?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe it's just the parent in me again. I usually will say, we don't teach our kids at home, then the world will teach them. So if you let the patients or that environment teach your students, residents, etc., that's the only thing they're going to hear.
Yes.
And then they won't have the perspective, at least from a safe learning environment.
And of course, if we're trying to create a safe learning environment, we're also trying to create physicians who will also be respectful of people with diverse backgrounds and different kinds of patients. So one thing is to also speak up promptly and make it clear that you value everybody's input and that you won't allow inappropriate comments to stand. That's not going to be tolerated in your learning environment. And students need to feel empowered to speak out. So step in if someone does something that is inappropriate. I can tell you that in my previous job, it was part of my job to observe teaching. I did it quite often, every quarter. And I was sitting in a classroom watching a game. It's called a desert survival game. Some of you may have played it in management classes. But what it is if you were the group, you've all crash landed in the desert, and here's a list of items that you've managed to get out of the aircraft. You're who you are, you're not playing different characters. And the whole task is you get together and you decide as a group to put in order of priority what all of these items are in terms of your survival. It's a simple game. So there's all kinds of different things on the list. And one of the female students in one of the groups said, I think the mirror might be important. And one of the male students in this group said, why, you want to check your makeup? And that woman never said another word throughout the entire session. She never spoke up again. And they went on and they made their list while she sat there and didn't speak in this small group activity. And the instructor didn't say a word about this comment, right? Just let it pass. And I'm going to give you 3 guesses as to what the number one most important thing is on that list. The mirror, right? Because if you're lost, a mirror can signal, the light can be seen from miles and miles away. It was the number one most important thing. And the game isn't about surviving in the desert, of course. It's about working as a team. But that's even more important to call that kind of behavior out with an activity that's really about teamwork, right? So he successfully silenced that young woman, and I would suspect that she probably was silenced from that point forward in that class because the teacher obviously did not have her back. So sometimes people find it difficult in that situation to call it out because it's uncomfortable, that discomfort level. We have to be okay with feeling a little uncomfortable sometimes. They often think of 100 things they should have said on the drive home that night. Oh, I should have said this, I should have done that. So think about and have a narrative ready so that if it happens, you know, and you just basically go to your script. Here's an example. What you said made me uncomfortable. Although you may not have meant it that way, what you said could be interpreted as saying that our female colleagues' contributions aren't respected, right? For example. So having something like that kind of in the back filed away so that in the moment you know what to say, because a lot of times people say, well, I wanted to say something, I just didn't know what to say. Think about that and be ready. So many educators frame difference as deficiency. So you hear people saying things like, you know, I'm really struggling because most of my learners don't speak English as their first language. So I always try to unpack that and think about what they're saying here. So instead of seeing the fact that somebody speaks more than one language as a plus, you're seeing it as a disadvantage. I don't know about you. I only speak English. I'd love to be able to speak multiple languages. I mean, that's amazing to me. So we often frame something as a deficiency, which really is an advantage, and try to see cultural difference in your learners as an advantage, considering that they're bringing nuances and diverse points of view into your learning environment. So here is an image. You know, there's been a lot of attention lately given to research on corporations. A little outside of our area, but I have a point. And what this research shows, is that it consistently shows that companies that have more diversity have higher profits. So clearly, there's an advantage to having diverse points of view represented. In this case, what does it corporations care about? They care about the almighty dollar, and it is shown, it's been shown in a number of studies now, that companies that are more diverse make more money. So you can just translate that into learning environments that are more diverse, probably provide a richer learning experience for our learners. So we have a case study. Do we have time? We still have time to do at least one of these case studies, right? So I'm going to let you introduce the case study. Which one do you want to do? The Adrian one? Or
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do it.
I'll hand it out while you're talking about it.
So what you're gonna do is take some time to read this. In essence, you're gonna discuss the attitude and or motivational issues that have arisen. Since you've been in pairs, you can actually have one individual play the teacher and the other individual play the learner to lead your discussion. But again, meet to discuss the attitude and or motivational issues that have arisen from the case that you're actually dealing with.
Situation and what? Say again, please.
Discuss the attitude and motivational issues that have arisen.
Depending on how long this takes, I might go for the second one too, but we'll see. So after you've read through it, you want to have the meeting between Dr. Giles and Adrian Chan. So one of you play the student and one of you play the teacher. And role play that conversation. This is not the Academy Awards. You don't have to be great actors. Just try to stumble through it as best you can.
We need to read the role of another person too, or no? Just read the whole role.
You've read it through. You should have read it through, right?
Oh, yeah, I did.
So one person should be the teacher and one should be the learner. So he's tried to reach out to him. He said, I'm fine. Now you've called, the teacher's called him into his office and want to have a conversation about what's going on.
We're meeting after, right?
Right. This is he's sitting he's been called to the office and he's trying to have this conversation.
Professor Giles.
So what's at the moment? You're trying to find out
Yeah.
the motivation.
So you tried to reach out to him. He kind of brushed you off, but you feel like
Right.
you need to address it, right?
Because I think knowing where the conversation's going, that's where I definitely end up at.
What will you guys
Do
play?
it or
You're gonna do this?
You're the instructor.
The next one is 3 groups, so you can get into it.
But I got into that very nice website. It's not actually
No, I
wanting
mean, I guess that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Dr. Tyrrell,
get them to review, but if you're
I
not
think we
willing
may have to
to
engage with some of the groups as a whole, because I can see we need to actually discuss issues and motivation as a group. Because in the
absolutely.
interview process, it's easy to default to being the student who's already said nothing's wrong.
Which is what we wanted to do, but now we need to come together and discuss the challenges that happen there.
So you're trying to.
Okay. I'm going to end your pain and bring everybody back together.
And I'm going to throw the ball around. Should we call on you to actually provide an example of your experience with the motivational issues or attitude issues associated with this interaction?
So what were some of the challenges? Go ahead and toss to one of the teams.
Oh, I like this. Okay. A toe sheet. I threw it right in the area where there was no way she could let it go out. Toward her torso.
I've been known to throw it right at someone's head if they're ignoring me.
When
I was teaching.
Please share some of your challenges during our final moments together.
Well, Adrian seems very short-answered, so I was
I thought you were going to
Dr.
go
Larry's birthday. He asked me if anything was wrong, and I just said a short answer, and I said, no, nothing's wrong. And then continued to ask me, is there anything going on, or he just elaborated on the questions, and I said, nope, there's no reason for me acting this way.
And so the initial challenge is, I think you were saying at the beginning.
I
that-
was short-answered, so.
And so how would we deal with that, especially from a faculty perspective, because you're trying to actually draw the student out?
So it's not like I haven't been in this situation before. And I think from Adrian's viewpoint, Dr. Giles is part of the problem. And I'm not really sure Adrian would ever actually open up to him or her. Now that I think I don't, no, it says Josh, but I don't know, good Josh King, so, sorry, right? So, one of the things that I would sort of say is, we got to find Adrian somebody who he can trust and actually talk about these particular sort of issues, right? Because it's clear to me, right, that, Adrian, Dr. Giles has done things that Adrian has found to make him uncomfortable. And I don't think he'll ever open up to at least not in this sort of short conversation that we're having.
Thank you. Another group?
One more, but we're kind of, I want to be respectful of people's time.
I was
so
trying to use
wanna-
your strategy of 3. I was trying to be consistent.
Go ahead. One more
No,
group.
this is good interaction.
Does anybody have something they found was really challenging when they were doing the activity?
No, I agree with Dr. Liu because I think when you're 20, I assume this is college,
Mhm.
and you might not, your parents are always telling you what to do, and you have to live by their rules, so to speak. So when you get to the college and then somebody asks you to speak up, and then you're sliced in half, then, and I agree that you probably would not be coming back. And then there's people who, I told her, she says, what's my problem? I said, I'm an introvert, I like to stay quiet. But if somebody asks me, because he challenged, if I've never been challenged in my entire life, I actually didn't really start speaking out to myself until I married an attorney who argued with me about everything. So I had to argue
Well,
back.
You bring up a very interesting point, which is that whenever I've used this role play before, often people frame it as, how do we fix Adrian
Right.
and get him to change his behavior? When maybe Dr. Giles needs to think about, maybe there are other ways to engage the class as a whole to ensure that just participating in these small group discussions isn't like the entire class, when clearly he's got at least one learner who's not comfortable doing that. Does that make sense? So we're framing already the automatic assumption that Adrian's the issue, that we need to somehow draw him out and get him to participate. But it may be, just a cultural difference that he just doesn't feel as comfortable speaking up.
And all I would echo is that was one of the earlier strategies about including the entire class. Here, you wanted to keep doing small group sessions, but one individual wasn't benefiting from it. You can't keep that being the pervasive primary instructional strategy to facilitate learning. So you have to include the whole class. You may have to do more whole class learning instead of small group.
So notice here number 3, should the course be adjusted to be more relevant or inclusive? Now I'm going to go just real quickly to something because I know we're over our time, but I think it's really important. And that's when someone brings a challenge to you. A student comes to you and says they feel like they're being discriminated against based on their gender or their ethnicity. That is always a challenge. And they're never easy to get at the very heart of who we are as people. So experts have recommended some do's and don'ts. Maybe you've heard these before. I will go quickly, and if you want copies of the slides, let me know, and you can look at them a little more closely. So first foremost, don't assume the investigator role. If someone comes to you and they say, this is how I was treated, you don't immediately put on your investigator hat and say things like, did anyone else hear him say that? How many people were standing around when it occurred? Why not? Because it feels like to the learner that you're not believing them, right? That I'm questioning and challenging your lived experience. Don't minimalize or trivialize what the learner is telling you. Oh, gee, that could have been so much worse. Don't judge him harshly. He's a pretty nice guy usually. But, sometimes people say stupid things, right? Keep in mind that if someone's coming to you with an issue, probably there's a very strong likelihood that this is the straw that broke the camel's back, that it is not the first time this has happened. And by minimalizing it or trivializing it, you're saying that it's not that important. Also, don't try to explain away someone's behavior. Avoid comments like, I'm sure he didn't mean that. Well, he's a very different generation. Or he was raised in a very different culture. I actually heard that one right here at UCR. Someone say that about some sexist behavior that someone was engaged in. Oh, she's under a lot of stress. He's just trying to be funny. Rationalizing it or explaining it away. Don't deny the impact that the incident had on the marginalized learner, even if it wouldn't have had that impact on you. Right? Just because you wouldn't have been offended by it, who cares? Not about you. It's about the person who's bringing you the issue. So don't say things like, I don't understand what the big deal is. Sometimes we have to work with difficult people. You just need to learn to deal with it. Those kinds of comments. Don't compare your experience. We've actually covered this already, but, I understand. It's like that time when I had a professor who did wrong. You should have been in med school when I was in med school. It was so much worse then, those kinds of comments. That it's not about you. Don't assume that others will or should react the way you would have reacted, and don't assume there's only one course of action to take. It's especially problematic sometimes if you share the issue with the individual. If they're talking about gender discrimination and I've been discriminated against, or if they're talking about racial discrimination and I've been discriminated against based on my race, it's sometimes you assume that the way they responded is the way that you would have responded. So things like, you need to confront him about this right away. You can't let this stand. You need to go to HR and file a report. Maybe that's what I would do, but you don't want to prescribe that to the learner. Or on the other side, you just have to learn to ignore people when they act like that. I always try to walk away and calm down before I say anything. Don't disengage if the learner becomes emotional. Don't deny the learners the right to feel what they feel, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, whether it's hurt. They have a right to feel what they feel. So, saying things like, getting angry isn't going to do any good, or saying things like, maybe you should calm down and we can talk about this later. No one has ever calmed down when someone told them to calm down. If you tell someone to calm down, it's like throwing gasoline on the fire. They're already angry. Don't tell someone to calm down. When has that ever helped? Here's some do's. Do listen with compassion and give them time to share their experience. Do thank the learner for sharing it with you, because trust me, it wasn't easy for them to make that decision to bring it forward. Acknowledge the stress that the situation likely caused them. Be aware that these kinds of experience can undermine a learner's confidence in their academic or their professional abilities. So emphasize that the incident they shared does not reflect on them, and it does not reflect on their merit. Talk about the value you place on ensuring that they feel welcome and included. and state that their experience matters to you, regardless of the intent of the person who did whatever it is they're talking about. This can be especially helpful if the learner says things like, you know, I know he didn't mean anything by it, but it really bothered me, right? So those kinds of comments, it doesn't matter what that person's intent was. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it. It's really, what we're talking about is it's about how it affected the learner that's sitting in front of you. That's what counts. Find out what the learner wants. What do they want from you? What are they seeking? It can be useful to present options if you don't get a clear idea of what they want. One thing to be a sort of caveat, a warning, is there may be certain issues where you're mandated to report it, and if someone comes to you in confidence, it's always a tricky bit of business to try and anticipate that they might be saying something that you have to report. So make sure, if that's the case, that you get it into the conversation as quickly as you can so that they don't reveal something in confidence that you now are required to report. You know, for example, you may have a policy at your workplace that says if someone physically intimidated someone else, it automatically has to be reported to HR. So they came to you in confidence, and now you're having to file a report. At the beginning of your discussion, you might want to say something like, I want you to know that I will keep everything you say to me in confidence unless it's about these issues, in which case I am required to report them. So for example, at a previous institution, we were mandated reporters for physical violence and domestic violence. So I had a student who came to me and she was upset. She started telling me about what was happening with her boyfriend, and I saw where it was going, so I stopped her. And I said, you know, if you're about to tell me that you're being abused by your boyfriend, please know that I want to help you, but I am required to report anything you tell me about that. Now, fortunately, the next thing she did was show me the scars and the bruises. And I took her, of course, immediately to the counseling center and filed the report. Fortunately, she wanted help, but sometimes people are coming in confidence without realizing there may be certain things that you cannot keep confident, and that can really break trust if you don't get that in there, right? And say, you know, if you're going to tell me about child abuse, I have to report it. Share whatever campus or institutional resources that are there for the learner. And finally, at the end of the discussion, determine what, if any, action will be taken as a result of this conversation, and then follow up if appropriate. Sometimes it's not appropriate. Sometimes when something gets reported to HR, you're out of it, right? You don't even know what's going on now. So after you've taken the agreed upon action. So it's important also to educate yourself. People in marginalized group get tired of having to educate other people about issues related to their group. And I think this is a good place to end on, which is silence doesn't always mean yes. Sometimes it means I'm tired of explaining to people who don't even care enough to understand. There are mountains of information out there, books and articles and websites. You don't have to ask a person of color, well, is this, okay? You can educate yourself. It's not their job to teach you how to be more culturally sensitive. And I know we've gone over time. I do apologize for that. Anna has some evaluation forms. I'm going to ask for your indulgence for just one more minute as she hands those out. I also want to point out a couple of things in the book that I didn't get to talk about yet. One is our upcoming programs. We always like you to know what we've got coming up next. Also, that our medical education, our professional certificate in medical education program is up and running. It's full force. So the next class, Foundations of Curriculum, is open for enrollment right now. This is a wonderful program. If you're interested, it's for all professionals. So even though I will admit the first class was primarily physicians, we did have some nurses in there, PAs, scribes, anyone who's interested in teaching as part of their profession. And also, we just finished our wonderful Teaching Excellence Academy. We have one of the graduates right here among us. And we will be starting recruiting for the next cohort very soon. So if you go on the Office of Faculty Development website, you can learn more about that program. I'll stop talking now and let you do your thing. Yes, ma'am? To upload. I did remember to record it. Just give it a minute more. And lastly, I just want to say thank you so very much for coming out and participating tonight. Really, really appreciate it. I know time is probably one of your most precious commodities.
And I took a very